Welcome. Today's lesson is on the Mid-Tribulation Rapture. If you have not already watched the Rapture overview, you'll want to watch that first because I'm going to assume that you know some of the terminology that is shared in that. This is one of 4 different views that we will be discussing, 4 views of the Rapture. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. You can see the PowerPoint. Okay, this is the Mid-Tribulation Rapture. And this chart I thought was very handy in explaining just giving us a good visual of it. So you'll see these purple arrows that represents Jesus. So you see Christ living here, this arrow, and then he dies at the cross, is buried or resurrected, is on earth for appears multiple times to various people. Then he is ascended up and goes up to heaven, and he is up in heaven during this church age, 2,000 years up to this point so far at least. And then we see that he's coming back down to meet us in the air for the rapture, and then going right back up and then coming back down for the second coming here, at least according to the mid-tribulation rapture idea. And then you see him reigning on earth for 1,000 literal years. That's the millennium. So this is just a chart to show you how they break it down. There's 3.5 years, and in the middle is the rapture, and then there's another 3.5 years. The church, they believe, will be kept from the last and worst 3.5 years, this last half of the tribulation. So let's go ahead and look at the verses here that they're just using to describe that. So go to Daniel 9:27 with me. Daniel 9:27 says, he, and that he means the Antichrist, if you had time to read the whole context. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering, and the abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. So this is just describing when the Antichrist comes in the middle of the 3.5 years, and that just shows that time period, saying in the middle of the week. They're just trying to describe, all these verses describe where in the week he starts to turn and puts the abomination of desolation up and all of that, which you'll learn about more in the Antichrist lesson. 12 verse 7. Go to Daniel 12 verse 7. Then I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the water of the river. He raised both his hands toward heaven and swore by him who lives eternally that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. When the power of the holy people is shattered, all these things will be completed. So time, and half a time is another way of saying 3.5 years. And going on to verse 11, it says, from the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. So that's telling you about the last half before the second coming. Now go into Revelation 11:2, and we're going to see parallels there to what is described in Daniel. That's Revelation 11, verse 2. But exclude the courtyard outside the temple. Don't measure it, because it is given to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. So this is describing that time when that 42 months would be equivalent to that 3.5 years. And that is the time period when they are just allowed to just run crazy in the holy city of Jerusalem. Now 12 verse 6. Revelation 12 verse 6. The woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God to be nourished there for 1,260 days. So that's also talking about the 3.5 years. Now go on to verse 12, verse 14. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent's presence to her place in the wilderness where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time. And you see the same language that's used in Daniel right there. So since we are covering some of these verses, when we get to scriptural support, just know we've already covered these verses that are used by mid-tribulation rapture to describe that breakup of the time periods. Now, let me give you just some about the history of the mid-tribulation rapture. There are no early church fathers who teach a mid-tribulation rapture. If you already watched the discussion of the overview of rapture views, you know that both pre-trib and mid-trib are not considered historical premillennial positions, that they came about after dispensational premillennialism was articulated. So no early church fathers taught or believed this position or shared this in their writings. In 1941, Gleason Archer shares a mid-tribulation perspective in his article, The Case for the Mid-70th Week Rapture Position, in Norman B. Harrison's book called The End, Rethinking the Revelation. So this is not a whole book, it's just an article within a book that has multiple views about when the rapture takes place. So let's look at who is who. And I like to put pictures up here so you have a face with a name. This first one we already mentioned is Gleason Archer. He was a pastor and professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he is one of the first to articulate the mid-tribulation rapture view. We also have J. Oliver Buswell, who was a professor and president of Wheaton College. He also worked at various other seminaries, and he also holds to this view. So these are the important people who hold to this view. It's not a very popular view, so there are not that many. I could not find that many to even list here. Now let's go on to the arguments that the mid-tribulation view uses to defend their position. The church will experience the less severe natural problems associated with the first half of the tribulation period, but will be raptured before the Antichrist begins to persecute believers in the second half. If you remember back to our chart, that first 3.5 years, they believe less severe things will be taking place and they'll be more natural. So if you think about, if you've done the presentation on the seals, you know that those first seals tend to be natural occurring things, wars, which we've been having for thousands of years, and famines and plagues and all those kinds of things that occur naturally. They're not calling that the wrath of God or even the wrath of Antichrist. So those, they believe, will be endured by Christians, but not the persecution of believers in the second half. So they think believers will not suffer the wrath of God, but are not exempt from the tribulation in this world. And so by tribulation, what we just described, like disease and famines and wars and rebellions and that kind of thing. They're not exempt from that, but they are going to be exempt from the wrath in the second half. There must be an interval between the rapture and second coming so that some have a chance to become believers between the rapture and second coming, since there are some who will enter into the millennial kingdom in non-glorified bodies. Okay, and so interval, they believe that there has to be at least some time. So like the other two views, post-trib and pre-wrath, basically believe that we're raptured right before the wrath happens, like within hours or days or whatever. There's not much of an interval. Whereas this position believes there is a space, and that there has to be a space to give enough time for some people to come to faith during that time period. And if you've watched the Left Behind series, you know that that's what they describe, and have people who are getting saved after the rapture occurs. And the reason they believe that is important is because there are people who go into the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, who were obviously not raptured, so they weren't Christians at the time of the rapture, but they don't take the mark of the beast, because all those who take the mark of the beast are immediately destroyed and go to hell at the Battle of Armageddon. So at that time, so they can't go into the millennial kingdom. So they think of that, those people that it's very ambiguous in the Bible. We're not really sure who these people are. So they're saying that's where we get these people who become converts between the rapture and the second coming. So that's why they believe they have to be two separate events. And so there's some merit to that view. It's a problem that, for the post-tribulation and pre-wrath to describe or to explain who these people are that are going into the millennial kingdom. It's a problem in general because the Bible doesn't really articulate it. Okay. Number 4, they believe the rapture occurs after the tribulation, but before the great tribulation. So don't get confused by that. So they mean lowercase tribulation, basically the birth pangs, the first few seals and that kind of thing, maybe the first few trumpets, but before the great tribulation, meaning that time of oppression when the Antichrist is reigning and is fully in power on the earth. And they get this idea from these 2 verses. So let's look up Romans 5:9. So turn with me to Romans 5:9. How much more then, since we have now been declared righteous by his blood, meaning Jesus' blood, will we be saved through him, Jesus, from wrath? So here that talks about being saved from wrath. And 1 Thessalonians is going to reinforce that. So go to 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 10. 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 10. And to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath. So once again, you see it talking about wrath. So they believe that wrath is referring to the wrath of God at the end of time during the last days. And they would define that wrath as that great tribulation period. Now, if you're talking to pre-wrathers, they would call that time of wrath that they would say that is not the Antichrist's wrath happens during that time, and that God's wrath is not until the day of the Lord. And post-tribs would also say that wrath, I'd have to clarify that. They're defining the wrath as sometime. It's kind of more vague in their position. But I'm going to throw something out, and pre-wrath, I think because they are more, that view kind of came out anticipating and arguing possibly against pre-trib and mid-trib positions. So they felt like they had to deal with this question of wrath. But honestly, if I just read these verses from a straight, like within context view, I don't even take the description of wrath to mean the wrath of the last days of the end time. I just don't. I see that as the wrath that is given to those in eternal punishment in hell. So it doesn't specify or get specific, but since it's talking about redemption and Jesus saving us from, since the context is redemption and what his work on the cross, it doesn't even talk about end times right there. That's talking about, in both of those cases, to me, it's talking about eternal wrath in hell, the punishment there. So I don't even think that we have to, I don't think it's relevant to the end at all. Okay, so just going on, there is a difference between the first section of the tribulation, which is called the signs of the end, and the second section called the events of the end. So they make those distinctions and give them those labels. They emphasize 2 distinct periods of Daniel's 70th week, and you'll remember that from that chart I showed you at the beginning, where there's the first 3.5 and the second 3.5 and the first 3.5 of the 7-year period. That's often called Daniel's 70th week. Those 2 distinct time periods. So let's look at some of the verses that they point out in Jude. And Jude is only one chapter. So when it says Jude 14 and 15, it's not a chapter, that's just the verses. So turn to Jude. Verse 14. It was about these that Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam prophesied. Look, the Lord comes with tens of thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly concerning all the ungodly acts that they have done in an ungodly way, and concerning all the harsh things ungodly sinners have said against them. So that is describing those believers who come back with Jesus at the second coming. It doesn't really mention the rapture or when the rapture happens, but what they're saying is it makes sense for them that that if we're coming back with Jesus, it's not gonna, that they think there has to be a space of time, that you can't just immediately just come right back. So the return of Christ is not only for the saints, but with them. So they don't think rapture immediately precedes the second coming. Hopefully that makes sense, their logic in that. Personally don't think that that's a necessary step. I think you can turn around and come right back. But according to their position, the return of Christ is not only for the saints, but with them. So they think that there has to be this intervening time. Revelation 19, 11 through 16. 19:11 through 16 says, Then I saw heaven open, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and he judges and makes war with justice. His eyes were like a fiery flame, and many crowns were on his head. He had a name written that no one knows except himself. He wore a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. The armies that were in heaven followed him on white horses, wearing pure white linen. A sharp sword came from his mouth so that he might strike the nations with it. He will rule them with an iron rod. He will also trample the winepress of the fierce anger of God, the Almighty. And he has a name written on his robe and on his thigh, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So what they're pointing out here, similar to the Jude passage, is that the armies that were in heaven followed him on a white horse with pure white linen. So when they see that picture, they're thinking, well, you know, where'd they get the horses and the white linen? Like, did that all happen during the rapture? They think that there has to be some time period where believers are up in heaven and then they come down later at the second coming, if that makes sense. So I want us to think critically about this. Those passages do describe believers coming back with Jesus at his second coming. However, nothing in the passage requires that there be an interval between the rapture and that return, just like I was saying earlier. Nothing requires that. 1 Thessalonians 4:17, let's go there. This is a big passage that's used to describe the rapture. On, you know, all of the positions honestly use this and just interpret it differently. So just think about understanding that. Okay, sorry about that interruption. So 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Then we who are still alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. So what I'm pointing out from here is that 1 Thessalonians 4:17 says we will meet Jesus in the sky. He is coming down to earth to return. We meet him on the way and come down to earth with him. To me, that's the simplest explanation of it. But as you can see from the mid-trib and pre-trib views, they believe that there has to be that interval of time. So that is the end of the presentation. And next we will be getting into, stay tuned for our other studies. We'll be doing pre-tribulation next, followed by post-trib and pre-wrath. Thank you for joining us.